The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Wallace ranch as Victoria Elizabeth Wallace stood at her bedroom window, watching the dust clouds rise from the main road. Another carriage approached, the third this week, carrying yet another carefully selected bride-to-be for her younger brother James. Their father, Colonel Harrison Wallace, had made his intentions devastatingly clear during Sunday dinner the previous week, his weathered hands gripping his brandy snifter with the same authority he'd once used to command cavalry regiments during the war. "James will be 25 come October," the colonel had declared, his steel-gray eyes surveying his family with military precision. "High time he took a wife and secured the future of this ranch. I've corresponded with several distinguished families back east, and will be hosting a series of young ladies over the next month. By Christmas, I expect to see him properly engaged to a woman of suitable breeding and fortune." Victoria had felt her heart clench at those words, not for James's sake, but for her own reasons that she dared not voice aloud. At 23, she remained unmarried despite her father's increasingly urgent efforts to secure her an advantageous match. The colonel's patience with his eldest child's romantic independence was wearing thin, and she knew her own matrimonial ultimatum was fast approaching. "Victoria," her father had continued, turning his penetrating gaze upon her, "you'll serve as hostess during these visits. It's time you learned by example what proper courtship looks like, since you've been so resistant to my previous suggestions regarding your own future." The unspoken threat in his words had been unmistakable. Victoria's refusal to consider marriage to any of the eminently suitable gentlemen her father had paraded before her over the past 2 years had tested his considerable patience. She knew that her continued spinsterhood reflected poorly on the family's standing in their territorial society, where marriages were viewed as much as business alliances as romantic unions. Now, as she watched the approaching carriage slow at their front gates, Victoria smoothed her emerald silk morning dress and prepared to assume her role as the perfect hostess. The latest candidate was Miss Priscilla Harding of Boston, daughter of a railroad magnate and possessor of what her father described as considerable refinement and an even more considerable dowry. Victoria descended the grand staircase of the ranch house, her hand trailing along the polished banister that her father had imported from Tennessee oak specifically to impress visiting dignitaries. The Wallace ranch house was a testament to the colonel's determination to bring Eastern sophistication to the Wyoming Territory, with its 2-story Georgian architecture, wraparound porches supported by white columns, and interior appointments that would not have been out of place in a Virginia plantation house. In the foyer, James paced nervously before the tall windows, his dark hair freshly pomaded and his best suit pressed to perfection. At 24, he possessed the Wallace good looks, tall frame, broad shoulders, and the kind of rugged handsomeness that came from years of ranch work tempered by classical education. But Victoria could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he tugged at his collar as if it were a noose. "Steady, brother," Victoria said softly, adjusting his tie with sisterly efficiency. "Miss Harding is reportedly quite accomplished. Father says she speaks 3 languages and plays the piano with considerable skill." James turned to her with eyes that held a hint of desperation. "I don't care if she speaks 10 languages and plays the entire orchestra, Victoria. This feels like attending my own funeral. How am I supposed to court a woman I've never met, for reasons that have nothing to do with affection?" Victoria's heart ached for her brother, but she also understood their father's position. The ranch represented 3 generations of Wallace ambition and sacrifice. Their grandfather had claimed this land when it was nothing but wilderness and hostile territory. Their father had built it into one of the most successful cattle operations in Wyoming. The legacy required not just capable management, but strategic alliances and the kind of social connections that came through advantageous marriages. "Perhaps you'll find Miss Harding more agreeable than you expect," Victoria offered, though her words lacked conviction. "And remember, Father isn't demanding immediate declaration of love. He's simply asking you to consider the practical advantages of a well-arranged marriage." The sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the arrival of their guest, and within moments, their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, was ushering Miss Priscilla Harding into the foyer. She proved to be everything the colonel had promised: elegant, refined, beautifully dressed in the latest Eastern fashion, and possessed of the kind of porcelain prettiness that spoke of sheltered upbringing and expensive education. "Miss Harding," Victoria said, stepping forward with a gracious smile, "welcome to Wallace Ranch. I'm Victoria Wallace, and this is my brother James." Priscilla Harding curtsied with practiced precision, her blue eyes taking in the grand foyer with obvious appreciation. "Miss Wallace, Mr. Wallace, what a pleasure to finally meet you. Your father's letters gave me such wonderful impressions of your family and this magnificent estate." James stepped forward and bowed correctly, taking Miss Harding's gloved hand and raising it briefly to his lips in a gesture that spoke more of duty than desire. "Miss Harding, we're honored by your visit. I trust your journey from Boston was comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you," she replied, though Victoria noticed how her gaze lingered on the oil paintings adorning the foyer walls, the imported carpets, and the crystal chandelier that had cost their father a small fortune. "Your father was kind enough to arrange for a private car on the railroad, and the scenery through the mountains was absolutely breathtaking." Colonel Wallace appeared from his study, resplendent in his best suit and radiating the kind of authoritative charm that had made him successful in both military and civilian life. "Miss Harding, my dear, welcome to our home. I trust Victoria and James have made you feel at ease." "Completely at ease, Colonel Wallace," Priscilla replied, offering him a smile that Victoria recognized as carefully calculated to charm. "Your home is even more beautiful than your letters suggested." Victoria watched the introductions and pleasantries with growing unease. There was nothing objectionable about Miss Harding. She was lovely, well-educated, impeccably mannered, and clearly from excellent family. Yet something about the entire proceeding felt hollow, like watching actors perform roles in a play where everyone had memorized their lines but forgotten to feel the emotions. "I thought we might take a tour of the property this afternoon," the colonel was saying, "and this evening we'll have a small dinner party. Several of our neighbors are eager to meet you, and I believe you'll find our territorial society more refined than Eastern prejudices might suggest." "I'm certain I shall, Colonel," Priscilla replied smoothly. "I've heard wonderful things about Western hospitality, and I'm particularly interested in seeing how a successful ranch operation functions. Father's railroad interests have given me some appreciation for the cattle industry, but I've never seen it from this perspective." Victoria noted the subtle emphasis on successful ranch operation and father's railroad interests, the kind of delicate social maneuvering that reminded everyone present of the potential business advantages such a marriage might bring. It was expertly done, but it made Victoria's stomach turn with its calculated nature. As they moved into the parlor for refreshments, Victoria found herself studying James's face for signs of romantic interest. He was performing his part perfectly, asking appropriate questions about Miss Harding's journey, her impressions of the territory, her interests and accomplishments. But she could see no spark in his eyes, no indication that this beautiful, accomplished young woman stirred anything in him beyond polite regard. Miss Harding, for her part, seemed equally focused on making a favorable impression rather than discovering any genuine connection with her potential suitor. She complimented the ranch house appointments, praised the territorial scenery, and made intelligent conversation about cattle markets and railroad development. But Victoria observed no blushes, no shy glances, no signs of feminine attraction beyond strategic interest. "Miss Harding," Victoria said during a brief lull in conversation, "do you ride? We have some excellent horses, and the mountain trails offer spectacular views of the valley." "I do ride, though I confess my experience is limited to Central Park and occasional country house parties," Priscilla replied. "I would be delighted to see more of your beautiful property, though I hope you have a gentle mare suitable for a rider of my limited Western experience." James brightened slightly at this suggestion. "We have several gentle horses that would be perfect for mountain trails. Perhaps tomorrow morning, if the weather cooperates, we could ride up to Eagle's Point. The view of the entire valley is quite remarkable." "That sounds perfectly delightful," Priscilla agreed, though Victoria caught a slight hesitation in her voice that suggested horseback riding was more duty than pleasure for their guest. The afternoon proceeded with predictable propriety. Miss Harding admired the house, the gardens, the stables, and the various outbuildings that comprised the ranch complex. She asked intelligent questions about cattle breeding, feed management, and seasonal operations. She complimented Mrs. Chen's cooking and praised the territorial scenery with appropriate enthusiasm. In short, she performed her role as a prospective ranch wife with the same polished competence she might have brought to a Boston social gathering. Victoria found herself increasingly troubled by the entire performance. Not because Miss Harding was unsuitable, but because the suitability was so calculated, so devoid of genuine feeling. She watched James escort their guest through the proper motions of courtship, and saw a young man going through the motions of duty without a spark of authentic emotion. As late afternoon approached, Victoria excused herself to oversee dinner preparations, leaving James and Miss Harding chaperoned in the front parlor by Mrs. Chen's watchful presence. The kitchen was bustling with activity as the cook and her assistants prepared an elaborate meal designed to showcase both the ranch's prosperity and their sophisticated tastes. "Miss Victoria," Mrs. Chen said quietly, appearing at her elbow with the discretion that had made her invaluable to the Wallace household, "there's a situation developing at the South pasture that your father should know about." Young Thomas rode in to report problems with the new horses Mr. James purchased last month. Victoria nodded, understanding that ranch emergencies took precedence over social niceties. "I'll inform father immediately." "What kind of problems?" "Fence break, and several animals missing," Mrs. Chen replied. "Could be natural, could be rustlers. Either way, it needs attention before full dark." Victoria found her father in his study, reviewing papers related to cattle shipments and railroad schedules. "Father, there's been a problem at the South pasture. Thomas reports missing horses and broken fencing." Colonel Wallace looked up sharply, his military instincts immediately engaged. "How many horses missing?" "I don't have details, but Mrs. Chen says it requires immediate attention." The colonel rose from his desk with the swift efficiency that had characterized his approach to every crisis during Victoria's lifetime. "I'll need to ride out immediately. Victoria, you'll need to entertain Miss Harding this evening. James can escort her to dinner, but I'll likely not return until well after dark." Victoria felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of managing an important social evening without her father's authoritative presence, but she nodded with the competence expected of a Wallace daughter. "Of course, father. Shall I send word to the neighbors that you may be delayed?" "No, let the evening proceed as planned. Miss Harding's comfort and entertainment are paramount. This visit is too important to be disrupted by ranch business." He paused at the door, fixing Victoria with his penetrating stare. "I'm counting on you to ensure everything goes smoothly. Our family's reputation and James's future may depend on the impression we make this week." As her father departed for the stables, calling for his foreman and several ranch hands to accompany him, Victoria returned to the parlor to find James and Miss Harding engaged in stilted conversation about Boston cultural life. The artificial quality of their interaction was even more pronounced in the absence of the colonel's commanding presence. "I'm afraid father has been called away on urgent ranch business," Victoria announced. "But dinner will proceed as planned, and our neighbors are eager to meet you, Miss Harding." "How exciting," Priscilla replied with a kind of bright enthusiasm that suggested she found ranch emergencies rather romantic. "I've read about cattle rustlers and frontier dangers in novels, but I never imagined I might witness such adventure firsthand." James looked uncomfortable at this romanticized view of what was potentially serious economic loss. "Let's hope it's nothing more dramatic than storm damage to fencing," he said diplomatically. "Rustling is less common than Eastern literature suggests, but missing livestock always requires investigation." As evening approached and their dinner guests began arriving, Victoria found herself increasingly impressed by Miss Harding's social accomplishments. She conversed intelligently with their neighbors about topics ranging from territorial politics to railroad development, demonstrated genuine interest in ranch life while maintaining appropriate feminine delicacy, and charmed everyone with her refined manners and quick wit. Mrs. Rebecca Marshall, wife of their nearest neighbor, pulled Victoria aside during a brief lull between dinner courses. "My dear, Miss Harding is absolutely delightful. Your brother would be fortunate indeed to secure such an accomplished bride. She has breeding, education, beauty, and family connections that could benefit the entire territorial community. Victoria smiled and murmured appropriate agreement, but her heart felt heavy as she watched James perform his courtship duties with mechanical precision. He was being the perfect gentleman, attentive without being forward, intelligent without being pretentious, charming without being frivolous. Yet she could see no genuine spark of attraction, no indication that Miss Harding stirred anything in him beyond respectful admiration. The evening's entertainment featured Miss Harding's piano performance, a technically perfect rendition of Chopin that showcased her musical education while remaining appropriately demure. The gathered company responded with enthusiastic applause, and several ladies commented on how wonderful it would be to have such accomplished musical evenings once Miss Harding was established as a permanent resident of the territory. "Miss Harding," said Judge Thompson, one of the territory's most influential citizens, "your performance was magnificent. We rarely have opportunity to hear such refined entertainment in our frontier community. I trust you'll find our territorial society more cultured than Eastern prejudices might suggest." Priscilla accepted the compliment with gracious modesty that spoke of excellent breeding and careful training in social graces. "Judge Thompson, I've been consistently impressed by the refinement and intelligence of Wyoming society. The combination of Eastern sophistication with Western energy and opportunity seems to me quite remarkable." Victoria observed how skillfully Miss Harding navigated the social evening, saying exactly the right things to charm each guest while maintaining the proper balance of confidence and humility expected in a young lady of good family. She was, in every measurable way, the perfect choice for James. Beautiful, accomplished, well-connected, wealthy, and possessed of the social skills necessary to be an asset to ranch life and territorial society. Yet as the evening progressed and Victoria watched her brother's increasingly strained attempts to appear romantically interested, she found herself wondering if perfection on paper translated to happiness in reality. Marriage was, after all, more than a business transaction, despite her father's pragmatic approach to the institution. The guests departed near midnight, each offering enthusiastic praise for Miss Harding's charm and accomplishments. As the house settled into quiet, Victoria helped their guest retire to the Blue Room, the ranch's finest guest accommodation, appointed with imported furniture and silk wallpapers that spoke of the family's prosperity and refined tastes. "Miss Wallace," Priscilla said as Victoria ensured she had everything needed for a comfortable night, "thank you for such a wonderful evening. Your territorial society is indeed more refined than I had expected, and your family's hospitality has been exceptional." "We're delighted to have you as our guest," Victoria replied, though she detected something in Miss Harding's tone that suggested calculation rather than genuine pleasure. "I trust you'll find the morning ride with James equally enjoyable." "I'm certain I shall," Priscilla replied, though again Victoria caught that slight hesitation that suggested horseback riding was more social obligation than anticipated pleasure. "Your brother seems a most admirable gentleman." Victoria bid their guest good night and made her way to her own room, her mind churning with conflicted thoughts about duty, desire, and the complicated nature of advantageous marriages. From her window, she could see lantern lights moving in the distance, indicating her father and the ranch hands were still dealing with whatever crisis had developed at the south pasture. As she prepared for bed, Victoria found herself thinking not about Miss Harding's obvious suitability or James's lukewarm response to his prospective bride, but about the strange emptiness she felt watching two intelligent, attractive people go through the motions of courtship without any apparent emotional connection. Was this what marriage was supposed to be? A practical arrangement based on mutual advantage rather than mutual affection? Her mother had died when Victoria was 15, too young to have learned much about the intimate realities of marriage beyond what she could observe of her parents' formal, respectful relationship. Colonel Wallace had been devoted to his wife in his way, but their marriage had always seemed more partnership than passion, more duty than desire. Perhaps that was simply how successful marriages functioned among people of their class and circumstances. Victoria fell asleep to the distant sound of returning horses and men's voices carrying across the night air, her dreams filled with vague anxieties about duty and desire, about the difference between suitable marriages and satisfying ones, about the price of security and the cost of settling for less than one's heart truly wanted. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, Perfect weather for the horseback ride that would give James and Miss Harding opportunity for more private conversation away from the formal constraints of parlor courtship. Victoria dressed carefully in her riding habit, intending to accompany them as chaperone while remaining discreet enough to allow genuine conversation to develop between the potential couple. At breakfast, Colonel Wallace appeared looking tired but satisfied, reporting that the missing horses had been recovered and the fence repairs completed during the night. "Storm damage," he announced, accepting coffee and fresh biscuits with obvious relief. "Several trees down in the south pasture, and the horses had simply wandered through the broken fencing. No real harm done." Miss Harding expressed appropriate concern and interest in the night's adventure, asking intelligent questions about ranch management and the challenges of maintaining livestock security in such vast territory. Victoria noted how skillfully she balanced feminine delicacy with practical interest, showing enough understanding to be a useful ranch wife while maintaining the refined sensibility appropriate to her Eastern upbringing. "I trust you slept well despite the excitement?" James inquired politely, offering Miss Harding fresh jam for her biscuits with the kind of attention that spoke more of good manners than romantic interest. "Quite well, thank you," Priscilla replied. "Though I confess the sounds of ranch emergency were rather thrilling. One doesn't experience such adventures in Boston drawing rooms." Colonel Wallace smiled approvingly at her response. "You'll find territorial life offers many experiences unavailable in eastern cities, Miss Harding. Some challenging, some rewarding, all requiring adaptability and strength of character." "I believe I should welcome such challenges," Priscilla replied with a kind of bright confidence that suggested she viewed frontier life as an entertaining novelty rather than a fundamental change in circumstances. "The combination of sophisticated society with Western adventure seems to me quite appealing." After breakfast, James and Victoria escorted Miss Harding to the stables, where the head groom had prepared Buttercup, the gentlest mare in their stable, along with James's favorite gelding and Victoria's spirited bay mare, Starlight. Miss Harding examined Buttercup with obvious nervousness disguised as enthusiasm, accepting the groom's assistance to mount with careful attention to maintaining proper seat and posture. "She's a beautiful horse," Priscilla said, though Victoria noticed how tightly she gripped the reins and how rigid her posture remained even after settling into the saddle. "Much larger than the horses I rode in Central Park." James guided their small party along the well-maintained trail that led up through pine forests toward Eagles Point, the rocky outcropping that offered spectacular views of the entire valley. Victoria deliberately fell slightly behind, giving the potential couple opportunity for private conversation while remaining close enough to fulfill her chaperone duties. The morning air was crisp with autumn's approach, and the aspen groves showed the first hints of gold that would soon transform the mountainsides into brilliant displays of seasonal color. Under different circumstances, Victoria might have thoroughly enjoyed the ride, the company, and the spectacular scenery. But she found herself increasingly troubled by the artificial quality of James and Miss Harding's interaction. They spoke of appropriate topics: her impressions of territorial society, his descriptions of ranch operations, mutual acquaintances from her family's business connections with Western cattle interests. Their conversation was intelligent, polite, and utterly devoid of the kind of personal revelation that might indicate growing romantic interest. Miss Harding praised the scenery with enthusiasm that sounded rehearsed, asked questions about cattle breeding that suggested she'd studied the subject for this visit, and made observations about territorial development that demonstrated her intelligence while maintaining appropriate feminine deference to masculine expertise. James responded with equal courtesy, sharing information about ranch operations, territorial politics, and his own educational background and future ambitions. Victoria listened to their careful exchange and felt her heart sink. They were two accomplished people going through the motions of courtship without any apparent emotional connection. There were no shared glances, no moments of laughter, no signs of the kind of personal attraction that should develop between potential marriage partners. As they reached Eagles Point and dismounted to enjoy the panoramic view of the valley spread below them, Victoria excused herself to check the horses, giving James and Miss Harding a few moments of relative privacy. From her position near the horses, she could observe without eavesdropping, and what she saw confirmed her growing concerns. James stood at appropriate distance from Miss Harding, pointing out various ranch landmarks and explaining the geography of their holdings. She listened with polite attention, asking occasional questions and making appropriate comments about the beauty of the view. But there was no intimacy in their interaction, no sense of two people discovering mutual attraction and compatibility. "The view is indeed magnificent," Miss Harding was saying as Victoria rejoined them. "I can understand why your family chose to build their home in this valley. The combination of natural beauty with agricultural potential is quite remarkable. The location offers both practical advantages and aesthetic pleasure," James agreed. "Our grandfather had excellent instincts for land selection, and father has developed the property to maximize both." Victoria found herself wondering if they would spend their entire courtship discussing practical matters and business advantages without ever touching on personal feelings, hopes, dreams, or the intimate concerns that should matter between potential marriage partners. Miss Harding was clearly intelligent and accomplished, but Victoria sensed she viewed this visit more as a business negotiation than romantic adventure. As they prepared to return to the ranch house, Victoria noticed a small group of riders approaching from the east, moving at the easy pace of men who knew the country well. She recognized their neighbor Ben Marshall and two of his ranch hands, but the fourth rider was unfamiliar, a tall man on a magnificent black horse who rode with a kind of natural grace that spoke of years in the saddle. "That's Ben Marshall and his crew," James said, following Victoria's gaze. "Probably checking on the fence repairs from last night's storm. Father mentioned some damage extended onto their property as well." As the riders drew closer, Victoria found herself studying the unfamiliar horseman with growing curiosity. He was clearly comfortable in Western working clothes rather than Eastern fashion, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low against the morning sun, his hands easy on the reins in the manner of someone for whom horseback riding was natural as walking. Even from a distance, she could see the confident set of his shoulders and the alert way he surveyed the landscape around them. "Victoria, James," Ben Marshall called out as the group reached speaking distance. "Hope we're not interrupting your morning ride. Wanted to check on the storm damage and introduce my new ranch manager." Victoria felt her breath catch as the unfamiliar rider touched his hat brim in polite greeting, revealing dark hair and eyes the color of winter sky, blue-gray with depths that seemed to hold secrets and stories. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marking him as a man who worked outdoors and lived by his own efforts rather than inherited privilege. "Miss Harding," James said with careful courtesy, "may I present our neighbor Ben Marshall? Ben, this is Miss Priscilla Harding of Boston, our house guest." Ben Marshall dismounted and approached with the kind of respectful informality typical of Western manners. "Miss Harding, pleasure to meet you. Hope you're finding territorial hospitality to your liking." "Indeed I am, Mr. Marshall," Priscilla replied, though Victoria noticed she seemed slightly uncomfortable with Marshall's direct manner and informal dress. "Your country is quite beautiful, though rather different from what I'm accustomed to. And this," Ben continued, gesturing to his companion who remained mounted, "is Luke Harrison, my new ranch manager. Luke's been working cattle operations throughout Colorado and Montana, but I managed to convince him our Wyoming Territory offers better opportunities." Luke Harrison dismounted with fluid grace and approached their group with easy confidence, removing his hat to reveal thick dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Victoria found herself studying his face with unwelcome fascination, noting the strong jawline, the slight lines around his eyes that spoke of years of outdoor work, and the way his attention seemed to focus completely on whomever he was addressing. "Miss Harding, Miss Wallace, Mr. Wallace," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that commanded attention without demanding it. "Pleasure to meet you all. Ben's told me good things about the Wallace Ranch operation." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks as Luke Harrison's gaze met hers directly, his expression respectful but somehow seeing more than mere social pleasantries. There was intelligence in his eyes, and something else that made her suddenly conscious of her appearance, her posture, her voice in a way that felt both uncomfortable and thrilling. "Mr. Harrison," she heard herself saying, proud that her voice remained steady despite the strange flutter in her chest. "Welcome to Wyoming Territory. I trust you'll find our cattle country to your satisfaction." "I'm certain I shall, Miss Wallace," he replied, and Victoria caught something in his tone that suggested he meant more than mere professional satisfaction with local ranching opportunities. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Luke Harrison displaying the kind of practical intelligence and quiet confidence that Victoria found increasingly compelling. He spoke knowledgeably about cattle breeding, range management, and the challenges facing territorial ranchers with the authority of someone who understood the business from years of hands-on experience rather than inherited wealth and Eastern education. Miss Harding participated in the conversation with appropriate interest, asking questions that demonstrated her preparation for ranch life while maintaining the delicate balance between feminine curiosity and proper deference to masculine expertise. But Victoria noticed how her attention seemed more focused on James's responses than on Luke Harrison's obviously superior knowledge of Western ranching operations. "We should return to the house," James said eventually, glancing at the son's position with the kind of practiced awareness that ranch life instilled. "Father will be expecting us for luncheon, and I'm sure Miss Harding would appreciate time to rest before this afternoon's activities." As they prepared to remount their horses, Luke Harrison appeared at Victoria's side with quiet courtesy. "Allow me to assist you, Miss Wallace," he said, offering his cupped hands as a mounting block in the Western fashion, rather than expecting her to require the formal mounting assistance typical of Eastern equestrian customs. Victoria felt an electric shock as his strong hands steadied her foot, the brief contact sending warmth up her leg that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine. She settled into her side saddle with perhaps more grace than usual, hyper-aware of his presence as he adjusted her stirrup with the competent efficiency of a man thoroughly familiar with horses and their management. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the unprecedented flutter in her chest. "Your assistance is most appreciated." "My pleasure, Miss Wallace," he replied, his blue-gray eyes meeting hers with an intensity that seemed to see more than mere social pleasantries warranted. "I hope we'll have opportunity to speak again during my time in the territory." Victoria felt her cheeks warm at the subtle implication in his words, the suggestion that he sought her company for reasons beyond neighboring courtesy. "I'm certain we shall, Mr. Harrison. The territorial community is small enough that paths cross frequently." The ride back to the ranch house passed in a blur of conflicted emotions for Victoria. She found herself stealing glances at Luke Harrison as he rode easily alongside Ben Marshall, the two men discussing fence repairs and cattle movement with the kind of practical focus that characterized successful ranchers. There was something about his quiet competence, his natural authority, his comfortable relationship with the demanding work of ranch life that appealed to her in ways she hadn't expected. At the same time, she was acutely aware of her duty as hostess and chaperone, maintaining appropriate conversation with Miss Harding while observing James's continued lack of romantic enthusiasm for his beautiful, accomplished prospective bride. The contrast between her own unexpected attraction to a virtual stranger and her brother's dutiful indifference to an eminently suitable marriage candidate struck her as deeply ironic. "Mr. Harrison seems quite knowledgeable about ranch operations," Miss Harding observed as they approached the Wallace property. "Though I confess I find his manner rather informal compared to Boston society." Victoria felt a strange defensive flutter at the subtle criticism. "Western manners tend toward directness and practical efficiency," she replied carefully. "Men who work with their hands and live by their own efforts often develop different social customs than those raised in Eastern drawing rooms." "Of course," Priscilla agreed quickly. "I meant no criticism. It's simply an adjustment, learning to appreciate different social styles. I'm certain such directness serves well in frontier circumstances." James seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of tension between the two women. His attention focused on the approaching ranch buildings and the various activities that would fill their afternoon. Victoria could see ranch hands working near the barns, preparing for the cattle drive that would take their summer-fattened steers to the railroad terminus before winter weather made such travel impossible. Colonel Wallace met them at the front porch, his authoritative presence immediately commanding attention as he inquired about their morning ride and expressed appropriate concern for Miss Harding's comfort and enjoyment. Victoria observed how their guest responded to her father's military bearing with a kind of respectful deference that suggested she appreciated strong masculine authority. "Miss Harding," the colonel said, offering his arm to escort her into the house, I trust the morning's adventure gave you favorable impressions of our territorial scenery. The view from Eagles Point is considered among the finest in Wyoming. Indeed it is, Colonel Wallace. Priscilla replied with enthusiasm that sounded more genuine than much of her previous conversation. The combination of mountain grandeur with pastoral beauty quite exceeded my expectations. I begin to understand why your family chose to build their legacy in such magnificent country. Victoria followed them into the house, her mind churning with thoughts of Luke Harrison's quiet confidence, his knowing eyes, the warmth of his hands as he'd helped her mount her horse. She tried to focus on her hostess duties, but found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the brief moments of connection she'd felt with a man she'd known for less than an hour. Luncheon proceeded with the kind of polished conversation expected in sophisticated territorial society. Miss Harding proved herself adept at drawing out information about local families, business connections, and social customs while sharing carefully selected details about her own background and accomplishments. She spoke of her education at a prestigious Boston finishing school, her family's railroad interests, her musical training, and her charitable work with appropriate modesty and intelligence. Colonel Wallace seemed increasingly pleased with their guest's combination of refinement and practical interest in ranch life. Victoria could see him mentally calculating the advantages such a marriage would bring. Business connections with Eastern Railroad interests, social connections with established Boston society, a substantial dowry, and a wife trained in the accomplishments necessary to enhance the family's territorial standing. "This afternoon," the colonel announced as they finished their meal, "I thought Miss Harding might enjoy observing our cattle operations. James can explain our breeding program and seasonal management practices, while Victoria shows you our domestic arrangements and household management systems." Victoria felt her stomach tighten at the prospect of spending hours showcasing the domestic aspects of ranch life, while James entertained Miss Harding with discussions of cattle breeding and property management. The gendered division of activities seemed designed to reinforce traditional marriage roles while giving the potential couple structured time together. "That sounds perfectly educational," Miss Harding replied with bright enthusiasm. "I'm eager to understand how a successful ranch operation functions from both business and domestic perspectives. My father's railroad interests have given me some appreciation for cattle industry economics, but I've never seen the practical implementation." As they prepared to begin the afternoon's activities, Mrs. Chen approached Victoria with the discreet efficiency that characterized all her communications. "Miss Victoria, there's a message from the Marshall Ranch. Mr. Marshall requests permission to bring his ranch manager back tomorrow to discuss shared water rights for the south pasture. Apparently the storm damage affected drainage patterns that concern both properties." Victoria felt her pulse quicken at the prospect of seeing Luke Harrison again so soon, but she maintained her composure as she responded. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Please send word that they're welcome to come for morning coffee and discuss whatever ranch business requires attention." Colonel Wallace, overhearing the exchange, nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Maintaining good relationships with our neighbors benefits everyone, and water rights require careful management to prevent future disputes. James, you'll want to review our property surveys and water usage records before tomorrow's meeting." The afternoon unfolded as Victoria had expected, with carefully orchestrated activities designed to showcase both the ranch's prosperity and Miss Harding's suitability as a rancher's wife. Victoria guided their guests through the house, explaining household management systems, introducing her to the domestic staff, and demonstrating the various aspects of maintaining a sophisticated home in frontier circumstances. Miss Harding proved attentive and intelligent, asking practical questions about seasonal food preservation, household budgeting, managing domestic staff, and coordinating the social obligations expected of a prominent ranch family. Her questions suggested genuine preparation for the realities of territorial life rather than romantic fantasies about Western adventure. "Your household systems are remarkably sophisticated," Priscilla observed as they toured the well-appointed kitchen and pantry areas. "I confess I hadn't expected such refinement in frontier circumstances. My Eastern prejudices suggested more primitive domestic arrangements." "Territorial society requires adaptability," Victoria replied, pleased despite herself by the compliment. "We must maintain the standards expected of our social position while accommodating the practical requirements of ranch life." It requires organization and efficient management, but it's certainly achievable with proper planning. Meanwhile, through the windows, Victoria could observe James escorting Miss Harding through the barn and corral areas, explaining their cattle breeding program and demonstrating various aspects of ranch operations. Even from a distance, she could see the stilted quality of their interaction. The way James performed his duties as host without displaying genuine romantic interest in his beautiful, accomplished guest. As late afternoon approached, Victoria found herself increasingly restless, her thoughts returning repeatedly to her brief encounter with Luke Harrison and the unexpected intensity of her reaction to his quiet confidence and natural authority. She'd met dozens of eligible men during her 23 years, including several her father had actively promoted as marriage candidates, but none had produced the kind of immediate, internal response she'd experienced during those few minutes of conversation at Eagles Point. The evening brought another carefully orchestrated social gathering, with several neighboring families invited to meet Miss Harding and observe the developing courtship between her and James. Victoria watched the proceedings with growing unease, observing how everyone seemed to assume the match was progressing favorably despite the obvious lack of romantic spark between the potential couple. Mrs. Rebecca Marshall, wife of Ben Marshall and one of the territory's most socially influential women, cornered Victoria near the refreshment table with the kind of pointed conversation that territorial ladies use to gather and disseminate information. "My dear Victoria," she said quietly, "Miss Harding seems absolutely perfect for James. Beautiful, accomplished, well-connected, and clearly prepared for ranch life. Your father must be delighted with how well the courtship appears to be progressing." Victoria murmured appropriate agreement while observing James's mechanical performance of courtship duties. He was being the perfect gentleman, but she could see no sign of genuine romantic interest in his interactions with their lovely, suitable guest. "I understand your husband's new ranch manager made quite an impression during this morning's encounter," Victoria said carefully, hoping her tone conveyed nothing more than polite social curiosity. Mrs. Marshall's eyes sharpened with interest. "Luke Harrison? Yes, he's proven quite capable in the few weeks he's been with us. Excellent credentials, extensive experience throughout Colorado and Montana, and the kind of practical intelligence that ranch management requires. Ben's quite pleased with his decision to hire him. He seems very knowledgeable about cattle operations," Victoria continued, fishing for more information while maintaining appropriate social discretion. "Indeed he is. Though I understand he's quite well educated as well. Ben mentioned he attended university back east before choosing ranch life over whatever career his family had planned for him. Sometimes the most interesting men are those who choose practical work over inherited privilege." Victoria felt her pulse quicken at this additional information. Luke Harrison wasn't simply a working ranch manager, but an educated man who'd chosen Western ranch life over Eastern opportunities. The combination of intelligence, education, and practical competence appealed to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The evening's entertainment again featured Miss Harding's musical accomplishments, this time a duet with Victoria that showcased both young ladies' training while allowing subtle comparison of their respective talents. Victoria found herself performing mechanically, her mind occupied with thoughts of blue-gray eyes and quiet confidence rather than the careful social performance expected of her. As the guests prepared to depart, Colonel Wallace pulled Victoria aside for private conversation in his study. The room smelled of leather, tobacco, and the subtle cologne he'd worn since her childhood, familiar scents that usually provided comfort but tonight seemed oppressive. "Victoria," he said, settling behind his massive desk with a kind of formal posture that signaled serious conversation. "I'm quite pleased with how Miss Harding's visit is progressing. She seems ideally suited to James, and I believe the match will benefit everyone involved." Victoria nodded carefully, uncertain where the conversation was heading, but sensing her father's words carried more weight than simple satisfaction with their guest's suitability. "Which brings me to a related matter," the colonel continued, fixing her with his penetrating stare. "Your own matrimonial situation requires attention, my dear. You're 23 years old, an age at which most young ladies of good family are well established in marriage with families of their own." Victoria felt her stomach drop as she recognized the approaching ultimatum she'd been dreading for months. "Father, I understand your concerns, but surely there's no urgent need for hasty decisions about my future. On the contrary, Victoria, there's considerable urgency, he replied firmly. I've been patient with your romantic independence, but that patience has limits. The territorial community expects families of our standing to make strategic marriages that benefit not only the individuals involved, but the broader social and economic networks that sustain our way of life. Victoria remained silent, knowing that argument at this point would only strengthen her father's resolve to control her matrimonial future. I've received several inquiries about your availability, the colonel continued, including a particularly advantageous proposal from Charles Harding of Boston. He's Miss Priscilla's older brother, heir to the railroad fortune, and quite interested in establishing Western business connections through marriage. Victoria felt the walls of her comfortable world closing around her as her father outlined a future that would bind her to a man she'd never met for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, attraction, or personal compatibility. Charles Harding will be arriving next month to finalize business arrangements with James and Priscilla, and to meet you with matrimonial intentions clearly established. I expect you to receive his attentions with appropriate consideration and give his proposal serious consideration. Father, Victoria said carefully, surely you wouldn't want me to enter marriage without some degree of personal affection for my intended husband. Even practical marriages benefit from mutual regard and compatibility. Colonel Wallace's expression softened slightly, revealing the paternal affection that existed beneath his authoritative manner. My dear, I want your happiness, but I also understand that lasting happiness often comes from security, stability, and mutual respect rather than romantic infatuation. Charles Harding offers all of those advantages, plus business connections that would benefit not only you, but James and the entire ranch operation. Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she contemplated a future bound to a stranger for the sake of business advantages and social expectations. Must everything be decided by financial considerations and social advancement? What about personal choice and individual happiness? Personal choice is a luxury available only to those with sufficient wealth and security to indulge their preferences, her father replied with a kind of pragmatic wisdom that had built their ranch empire. Marriage among families of our position serves purposes beyond individual gratification. It preserves and advances the interests of the entire family and community. Victoria excused herself from the conversation with appropriate filial deference, but her heart was churning with rebellion against the future being planned for her. As she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking not about Charles Harding and the advantageous marriage he represented, but about Luke Harrison's quiet confidence and the way his presence had made her feel more alive and aware than she'd felt in years. Sleep eluded her as she lay in her comfortable bed, staring at the ceiling and contemplating the difference between the life expected of her and the life she was beginning to want for herself. Through her window, she could see the lights of the bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived their simple, honest lives, free from the complicated social obligations and strategic considerations that governed her existence. The next morning dawned with the crisp clarity that characterized autumn in Wyoming Territory, and Victoria found herself looking forward to the promised visit from Ben Marshall and Luke Harrison with an anticipation that was both thrilling and troubling. She dressed with unusual care, selecting a deep blue day dress that complemented her coloring while maintaining appropriate modesty and respectability. Breakfast proceeded with polite conversation about the previous evening's social success and plans for the day's activities. Miss Harding seemed pleased with her reception by territorial society and optimistic about her developing relationship with James, though Victoria noticed her enthusiasm seemed more focused on social advancement than romantic attachment. Colonel Wallace announced his intention to spend the morning reviewing property surveys and water rights documentation in preparation for the business discussion with their neighbors, while James prepared to escort Miss Harding on another riding excursion to showcase additional aspects of the ranch property. Victoria found herself volunteering to remain at the house to oversee domestic arrangements and receive their morning visitors, a decision that earned approving nods from both her father and Miss Harding, who seemed pleased to have James's undivided attention during their ride. As the household settled into its morning routine, Victoria found herself checking the front windows with embarrassing frequency, watching for signs of approaching riders. When Ben Marshall and Luke Harrison finally appeared on the main road, her pulse quickened with an intensity that both thrilled and alarmed her. She met them at the front door with appropriate hostess courtesy, but found herself immediately drawn to Luke Harrison's steady presence and the way his attention seemed to focus completely on her when they spoke. "Mr. Marshall, Mr. Harrison," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Please come in. Father is expecting you in his study, and Mrs. Chen has coffee prepared." "Much obliged, Miss Wallace," Ben Marshall replied, removing his hat with frontier courtesy. "Hope we're not disrupting your morning routine." "Not at all," Victoria assured them, though her attention kept drifting to Luke Harrison's quiet presence and the way he seemed to fill the foyer with his steady confidence. "May I offer you refreshments before your business discussion?" As she guided them toward the study, Victoria felt hyper-aware of Luke's proximity, the way his boots sounded on the polished floors, the subtle scent of leather and sunshine that seemed to surround him. When their eyes met during the brief social pleasantries required by hospitality, she felt that same electric connection that had surprised her the previous morning. "Miss Wallace," Luke said quietly as Ben Marshall entered the study for his meeting with Colonel Wallace, "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you have a beautiful home. The combination of sophistication with frontier practicality is quite remarkable." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, which seemed to see and appreciate aspects of ranch life that visiting Easterners like Miss Harding treated as charming novelties rather than serious achievements. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she replied, noting how his presence made her more conscious of everything around them. The morning light streaming through tall windows, the polish on antique furniture, the distant sounds of ranch life continuing beyond their conversation. It's required considerable effort to maintain Eastern standards while accommodating Western necessities. "I imagine it has," he said, his blue-gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But the result speaks well of your family's determination to build something lasting and worthwhile in challenging country." Victoria found herself studying his face, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the strength in his jaw, the way his attention remained completely focused on her despite the business discussion proceeding in the nearby study. There was something about his presence that made her feel more alive and aware than she'd felt in years of proper social interactions with suitable gentlemen. "Mr. Harrison," she heard herself saying, "would you care to see the gardens while the business discussion proceeds? The morning light shows them to particular advantage, and I'd welcome the opportunity to hear your impressions of our territorial horticulture." Luke's expression warmed with what seemed like genuine pleasure at her invitation. "I'd be honored, Miss Wallace. From what I observed yesterday, your family has created something quite special here." As they walked together through the carefully maintained gardens that surrounded the ranch house, Victoria felt a sense of freedom and authentic connection that contrasted sharply with the artificial politeness that characterized most of her social interactions. Luke Harrison asked intelligent questions about plant selection, irrigation systems, and the challenges of maintaining formal gardens in frontier circumstances, but his attention seemed focused more on her responses than on gathering horticultural information. "You seem quite knowledgeable about practical gardening," he observed as they paused near a rose arbor that provided both beauty and relative privacy from the house. "Most ladies of your social position would leave such matters entirely to hired help." "I find the work satisfying," Victoria replied, surprising herself with her honesty. "There's something appealing about creating beauty and order through personal effort rather than simply directing others." Luke nodded with understanding that seemed to go beyond polite agreement. "I know what you mean. Some of life's greatest satisfactions come from work that allows you to see direct results from your own efforts." Victoria found herself studying his profile as he examined the climbing roses, noting the way morning light caught the dark strands of his hair and emphasized the strong lines of his face. There was something about his presence that made her feel both more comfortable and more alive than she'd felt during years of careful social interactions with allegedly suitable gentlemen. "Miss Wallace," Luke said quietly, turning to face her with an expression that seemed to hold more weight than casual conversation warranted, "I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I find myself curious about your impressions of territorial life compared to Eastern society. You seem remarkably well adapted to frontier circumstances for someone who could presumably choose to live anywhere." Victoria felt her pulse quicken at the personal nature of his question and the implication that he'd been thinking about her circumstances and choices. I was born here, Mr. Harrison. This territory is my home, not a temporary adventure or romantic escape from Eastern responsibilities. That explains the sense of belonging I noticed, he replied, his blue-gray eyes holding hers with increasing intensity. There's something about the way you move through this landscape, the way you speak about ranch life, that suggests deep roots rather than tourist curiosity. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks at his perceptive observation, and the way his attention seemed to see beyond the social performance expected of young ladies in her position. I love this country, Mr. Harrison. The mountains, the valleys, the sense of building something lasting in challenging circumstances. I can't imagine being content anywhere else. And yet, Luke said carefully, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he understood more about her circumstances than casual conversation should have revealed, I imagine your family has expectations about your future that might not align with your personal preferences. Victoria felt her breath catch at his insight into the matrimonial pressures that had been weighing so heavily on her mind. Family expectations are complicated matters, Mr. Harrison. Particularly for young ladies whose personal desires may conflict with social obligations and economic necessities. Luke's expression grew serious as he seemed to recognize the weight of constraint in her carefully chosen words. Miss Wallace, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but it seems to me that someone with your intelligence and strength of character deserves more consideration in such important decisions than social convention typically provides. Victoria felt tears gather in her eyes at his words, which acknowledged the conflict between personal desire and social duty that had been consuming her thoughts since her father's ultimatum the previous evening. Mr. Harrison, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion she was struggling to contain, your opinion is kind, but the reality is that families like mine must consider broader interests than individual preferences when making matrimonial decisions. Luke stepped closer, his presence warm and steady in the morning sunshine. Miss Wallace, perhaps this is presumptuous of me, but it seems to me that the most successful marriages are those based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared understanding rather than calculated advantage. Victoria found herself looking directly into his eyes, seeing understanding, warmth, and something deeper that made her heart race with possibilities she didn't dare acknowledge even to herself. That's a beautiful ideal, Mr. Harrison, she whispered, but ideals don't always align with practical realities. Before Luke could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their private conversation, announcing the return of James and Miss Harding from their morning ride. Victoria felt the spell of intimate conversation break as duty reasserted itself, reminding her of her obligations as hostess and chaperone despite her growing attraction to a man whose presence made her question everything she'd accepted about her future. As James and Miss Harding approached the garden area, Victoria quickly stepped away from Luke Harrison, her cheeks burning with the awareness of how their intimate conversation must have appeared to observers. She smoothed her skirts and composed her expression with the practiced efficiency of a young woman, accustomed to maintaining proper appearances regardless of her private emotions. Miss Wallace, Mr. Harrison, James called out as he dismounted and helped Miss Harding down from her side saddle. I trust your morning has been productive. Father mentioned water rights discussions were on the agenda. Indeed, Luke replied with the kind of easy composure that Victoria envied. Mr. Marshall is reviewing drainage patterns with your father. The storm damage has created some interesting challenges that will require neighborly cooperation to resolve effectively. Miss Harding approached their small group with bright curiosity, her riding habit immaculate despite the morning's excursion and her manner suggesting complete satisfaction with her developing relationship with James. Mr. Harrison, how delightful to encounter you again so soon. I trust your ranch management duties are proving satisfactory. Quite satisfactory, Miss Harding, Luke replied with polite courtesy that carried none of the warmth Victoria had heard in his voice during their private conversation. The Marshall operation is well established and efficiently managed. I'm fortunate to have found such an excellent position. Victoria observed the subtle dynamics of their interaction, noting how Luke's manner with Miss Harding remained professionally courteous while lacking the personal attention he'd shown during their garden conversation. Miss Harding, for her part, seemed to assess Luke through the lens of his usefulness to ranch operations rather than viewing him as a person worthy of social consideration. Victoria, James said, Miss Harding was quite impressed by the South Pasture operations. She asked several intelligent questions about seasonal cattle rotation and feed management that suggest genuine preparation for ranch life. Victoria murmured appropriate responses while struggling to focus on hostess duties rather than the continuing presence of Luke Harrison and the way his proximity made her hyper-aware of every sound, scent, and movement around them. The morning air seemed charged with unspoken possibilities and dangerous attractions that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "Perhaps we should join Father and Mr. Marshall," Victoria suggested, desperate to break the tension she felt building around their small group. "I'm certain their business discussion could benefit from additional perspectives on water management." As they moved toward the house, Luke fell into step beside Victoria with natural ease that felt both thrilling and appropriate, as if they'd been walking together for years rather than minutes. Miss Harding engaged James in animated conversation about their morning ride, her enthusiasm focused on the business aspects of ranch operations rather than romantic appreciation for her escorts company. In Colonel Wallace's study, they found Ben Marshall and their host poring over property surveys and water usage maps with the kind of focused attention that important business decisions required. The older men looked up as their group entered, and Victoria caught the sharp way her father's eyes assessed the arrangement of people and the subtle dynamics at play. "Ah, excellent timing," Colonel Wallace said, his authoritative voice immediately commanding attention. "We've identified several drainage issues that will require coordinated solutions between our properties. Mr. Harrison, your expertise in water management systems would be valuable in developing our response strategy." Luke stepped forward with quiet confidence, examining the maps and surveys with the kind of practical intelligence that Victoria found increasingly compelling. As he discussed technical solutions and implementation strategies, she observed how his knowledge encompassed both theoretical understanding and hands-on experience, the combination that produced truly effective ranch management. "The key challenge," Luke explained, indicating specific locations on the property maps, "is maintaining adequate water flow for both operations while preventing erosion damage during heavy weather. We'll need to coordinate our seasonal scheduling to ensure neither ranch suffers from timing conflicts." Miss Harding listened to the discussion with polite attention, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her preparation for ranch life while revealing her limited practical experience with such technical matters. Victoria noted how Luke answered her inquiries with courteous professionalism while reserving his more detailed explanations for the men who would be implementing the solutions. The business discussion continued for nearly an hour, with various technical and financial aspects of the water management project receiving thorough examination. Victoria found herself studying Luke's profile as he spoke, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the competent way he handled complex information, the natural authority he demonstrated without any need for aggressive assertion. When the meeting concluded with agreements for shared costs and coordinated implementation schedules, Ben Marshall expressed satisfaction with the collaborative approach to solving their mutual challenges. "This kind of neighborly cooperation benefits everyone involved," he declared, shaking hands with Colonel Wallace to seal their understanding. As the business participants prepared to depart, Luke approached Victoria with a kind of respectful formality that acknowledged her social position while carrying undertones of personal interest that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Wallace," he said quietly, "thank you for your hospitality this morning. The garden tour was particularly enjoyable, and I hope we'll have opportunity to continue our conversation about territorial horticulture in the near future." Victoria felt her cheeks warm at his carefully chosen words, which referenced their private discussion while maintaining appropriate social discretion. "You're most welcome, Mr. Harrison. I found our conversation quite enlightening as well." Colonel Wallace, ever alert to social undercurrents that might affect his family's interests, stepped closer with the kind of paternal oversight that reminded Victoria of her constrained circumstances. "Mr. Harrison, we appreciate your professional expertise in resolving our water management challenges. Your knowledge of ranch operations speaks well of Mr. Marshall's judgment in hiring you." "Thank you, Colonel Wallace," Luke replied with respectful formality that acknowledged the older man's authority while maintaining his own dignity. "I'm honored to contribute to solutions that benefit the entire community." As Ben Marshall and Luke Harrison departed, Victoria felt a sense of loss that seemed entirely disproportionate to the brief nature of their acquaintance. She watched through the front windows as they mounted their horses and rode toward the main road, her heart heavy with the awareness that social conventions would likely prevent any further private conversations with the man who had stirred such unexpected feelings. The remainder of the day passed with the kind of structured activities designed to showcase Miss Harding's suitability as a rancher's wife while giving James additional opportunity to develop romantic attachment to his beautiful, accomplished prospective bride. Victoria performed her hostess duties with mechanical precision, but her thoughts kept returning to Luke Harrison's steady presence and the way their brief conversation had made her feel more alive than years of proper social interactions. That evening brought the most elaborate social gathering yet arranged in Miss Harding's honor, with families from throughout the territory gathering to meet the young lady who seemed destined to become the next Mrs. James Wallace. Victoria dressed carefully in her finest evening gown, a creation of deep burgundy silk that complemented her coloring while maintaining the elegant sophistication expected of her social position. As guests arrived and filled the ranch house with animated conversation, Victoria found herself observing the proceedings with increasing detachment. Everyone seemed to assume James's courtship was progressing favorably, despite his obvious lack of romantic enthusiasm for his beautiful, suitable prospective bride. Miss Harding played her part perfectly, charming everyone with her accomplishments while demonstrating appropriate feminine deference to masculine authority. "Victoria, my dear," Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, the territory's most socially influential matron, cornered her near the refreshment table with a kind of pointed conversation that would be repeated throughout territorial society. "Miss Harding seems absolutely perfect for James. I understand congratulations may be in order quite soon." Victoria murmured non-committal responses while observing her brother's continued performance of courtship duties without apparent emotional engagement. James was being everything a gentleman should be: attentive, respectful, entertaining, informative. But she could see no spark of genuine attraction, no indication that Miss Harding stirred anything in him beyond dutiful regard. The evening's entertainment again featured musical performances, with Miss Harding demonstrating her accomplished piano technique while Victoria provided vocal accompaniment. As they performed together, Victoria found herself thinking not about the careful harmonies they created, but about the fundamental discord between social expectations and personal desires that seemed to characterize everyone's romantic circumstances. Colonel Wallace beamed with satisfaction as their guests praised Miss Harding's accomplishments and expressed enthusiasm for the anticipated engagement announcement. Victoria could see him mentally calculating the business advantages such a marriage would bring: railroad connections, Eastern social networks, substantial dowry, enhanced territorial standing. "Miss Harding's family connections will benefit the entire community," Judge Thompson observed during a quiet moment with Colonel Wallace. "Railroad interests are becoming increasingly important for territorial development, and having family ties to such influence could prove invaluable." Victoria felt her heart sink as she listened to conversations that reduced human relationships to business calculations and social advancement. Was this what marriage was supposed to be among people of their position? Strategic alliances designed to benefit everyone except the individuals actually entering into matrimonial bonds? As the evening wound toward its conclusion, Colonel Wallace approached Victoria with a kind of formal expression that signaled serious paternal conversation. "Victoria, please join me in my study before you retire. We have important matters to discuss regarding your future." Victoria's stomach clenched with dread as she recognized the tone that preceded life-altering pronouncements. She excused herself from the social gathering and followed her father into his private domain, the room that had witnessed every significant family decision during her lifetime. "Victoria," the colonel began, settling behind his imposing desk with military precision, "I've received confirmation that Charles Harding will arrive next week to finalize business arrangements with James and Priscilla, and to meet you with matrimonial intentions clearly established." Victoria felt the walls closing around her as her father outlined the future being arranged for her benefit. "I expect you to receive his attentions with appropriate consideration and give his proposal the serious attention it deserves." "Father," Victoria said carefully, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest, "surely you understand that marriage involves more than business advantages and social connections. Personal compatibility and mutual affection must surely factor into such important decisions." Colonel Wallace's expression softened slightly, revealing the paternal love that existed beneath his authoritative manner. My dear child, I want your happiness more than anything in this world. But I also understand that lasting happiness often comes from security, stability, and mutual respect rather than romantic infatuation that fades with time and circumstance. But what if there's another path to happiness? Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she contemplated possibilities that seemed both thrilling and terrifying. What if personal affection and practical compatibility could be found in the same relationship? Her father's eyes sharpened with the kind of military alertness that missed nothing of strategic importance. Victoria, I trust you haven't formed any inappropriate attachments during Miss Harding's visit. Your reputation and our family's standing depend on maintaining proper social boundaries. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized how transparent her emotions must be to someone who had spent decades reading people and situations for strategic advantage. I understand my obligations, Father. But surely personal feelings deserve some consideration in decisions that will affect the remainder of my life. Personal feelings are luxuries available only to those with sufficient security to indulge their preferences, Colonel Wallace replied with a pragmatic wisdom that had built their ranch empire. Charles Harding offers not only financial security and social position, but genuine affection for you based on your accomplishments and character. Victoria stared at her father in amazement. How can you speak of genuine affection from a man I've never met? How can feelings be genuine when they're based on strategic calculation rather than personal knowledge? The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying his daughter with the kind of assessment that had made him successful in both military and civilian leadership. Victoria, you're 23 years old, well past the age when most young ladies of good family are established in marriage. Your continued spinsterhood reflects poorly on our family's position and limits your own opportunities for security and happiness. Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she contemplated the future being planned for her, a life bound to a stranger for reasons that had nothing to do with personal choice or mutual attraction. Must everything be decided by financial considerations and social advantage? What about individual happiness and personal autonomy? Individual happiness is important, my dear, but it must be balanced against practical realities and family responsibilities, her father replied gently. You have obligations not only to yourself, but to James, to our ranch operation, to the broader community that depends on strategic alliances for prosperity and security. Victoria excused herself from the conversation with appropriate filial respect, but her heart was churning with rebellion against the constraints that seemed to govern every aspect of her existence. As she prepared for bed, she found herself standing at her window, staring out at the star-filled sky and thinking about Luke Harrison's quiet confidence and the way his presence had made her feel more alive than she'd felt in years. Sleep eluded her as she lay in her comfortable bed, wrestling with questions that seemed to have no satisfactory answers. Could she defy her father's expectations and social conventions to pursue a relationship with a man who stirred genuine feelings? Could she accept marriage to a stranger for the sake of family obligations and financial security? Was there any path forward that honored both duty and desire? The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching Victoria's troubled mood as she dressed for another day of hostess duties and social performance. At breakfast, Miss Harding seemed pleased with her social success and optimistic about her developing relationship with James, though Victoria continued to observe the artificial quality of their interactions. Your territorial society is indeed more refined than Eastern prejudices suggested, Priscilla was saying as she delicately consumed her morning meal. I believe I could be quite content building a life in such cultivated circumstances. James responded with appropriate courtesy, but Victoria could see the lack of genuine enthusiasm in his manner. He was performing his courtship duties with mechanical precision, but showing no signs of romantic attachment to his beautiful, accomplished prospective bride. Colonel Wallace announced plans for a final elaborate social gathering that evening, designed to provide Miss Harding with opportunity to solidify her connections with territorial society while giving James a perfect occasion for proposing marriage. The unspoken expectation was that the evening would conclude with an engagement announcement that would satisfy everyone's strategic interests. I've invited several additional families, the colonel explained, including the marshals and their household staff. It's important that our entire community have opportunity to meet Miss Harding and witness the happy conclusion of James's courtship. Victoria felt her pulse quicken at the prospect of seeing Luke Harrison again, even in the constrained circumstances of a formal social gathering. She told herself that her interest was merely the natural curiosity of a hostess ensuring her guests' comfort, but her racing heart betrayed the deeper truth of her attraction to a man whose presence had awakened feelings she'd never experienced. The day passed slowly, with elaborate preparations for the evening's entertainment consuming the household's attention. Victoria supervised domestic arrangements while wrestling with increasingly urgent questions about duty, desire, and the possibility of choosing authentic feeling over strategic advantage. As evening approached and guests began arriving, Victoria dressed with unusual care, selecting a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her coloring while maintaining appropriate elegance. She told herself her attention to appearance was merely hostess pride, but she knew her real motivation was the hope of seeing admiration in certain blue-gray eyes. The Marshall family arrived fashionably prompt, with Luke Harrison accompanying them in the capacity of valued ranch manager rather than social equal. Victoria felt her breath catch as she saw him enter her family's home, his dark suit emphasizing his tall frame and natural authority, while his manner remained respectfully aware of social boundaries. "Miss Wallace," Luke said quietly as she greeted the Marshall party, "thank you for including the ranch staff in your family's hospitality. It's a kindness not all employers would extend." Victoria felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, which seemed to acknowledge the social complexities of their situation while expressing genuine appreciation for her consideration. "Mr. Harrison, our territorial community succeeds through mutual support and shared celebration. Everyone who contributes to our prosperity deserves recognition." As the evening progressed, Victoria found herself hyper-aware of Luke's presence despite the social distance maintained by their different positions. He engaged in appropriate conversation with other guests while remaining respectfully peripheral to the main social activities centered on Miss Harding and James's courtship. The evening's entertainment reached its climax when Colonel Wallace called for attention, and James stepped forward with obvious reluctance to address the gathered company. Victoria felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the moment everyone had been anticipating, the formal proposal that would conclude Miss Harding's visit with appropriate romantic triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," James began, his voice steady despite the strain Victoria could see in his posture, "I want to thank you all for joining us in celebrating Miss Harding's visit to our territory. Your warm welcome has demonstrated the refinement and hospitality that make Wyoming society so exceptional." Victoria watched Miss Harding's face brighten with anticipation as James continued his carefully prepared remarks, praising her accomplishments, her beauty, her suitability for territorial life, and the advantages their union would bring to both families and the broader community. But as James approached the moment of formal proposal, something unexpected happened. Instead of dropping to one knee and offering the ring that Victoria knew their father had prepared, James paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled guests before settling on Miss Harding with an expression of honest regret. "Miss Harding," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of decision that surprised everyone present, "you are everything a gentleman could want in a wife. Beautiful, accomplished, intelligent, well-connected, and possessed of every virtue that makes for successful marriage. Any man would be honored to receive your affection and blessed to share your life." Victoria felt her breath catch as she recognized the tone of impending contradiction in her brother's carefully chosen words. "However," James continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "I've come to realize that honor and blessing require more than strategic advantage and social compatibility. They require genuine affection, mutual understanding, and the kind of personal connection that transforms marriage from obligation into joy." The assembled guests stirred with surprised murmurs as James's words deviated from the expected script of romantic conclusion. Miss Harding's face showed confusion mixed with growing alarm as she recognized that his remarks were leading away from proposal rather than toward it. "Miss Harding," James said with gentle finality, "you deserve a husband who loves you for yourself rather than for the advantages you represent. You deserve someone whose heart races when you enter a room, whose greatest happiness comes from your smile, whose devotion springs from passion rather than duty." Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she watched her brother choose authentic feeling over social expectation, despite the costs such choice would entail. The gathered guests seemed frozen with shock as James continued his unprecedented rejection of arranged marriage in favor of personal autonomy. "I cannot offer you that kind of love," James concluded with honest regret. "And you should not accept anything less than what you truly deserve." Colonel Wallace's face showed barely contained fury at this public disruption of carefully laid plans, while Miss Harding struggled to maintain composure in the face of unexpected rejection. The social gathering that had been intended to celebrate engagement instead became witness to the dramatic assertion of individual choice over family obligation. "James," Colonel Wallace said sharply, his military authority cutting through the stunned silence, "perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Our guests shouldn't be subjected to personal family matters." "No, Father," James replied with respectful but firm determination. "This decision affects everyone present, and everyone deserves to understand the reasons behind it. Miss Harding has honored us with her visit and deserves public recognition of her worth, even if I cannot offer her the marriage she seeks." Victoria felt a surge of pride in her brother's courage even as she recognized the storm that would follow such public defiance of parental authority and social convention. Miss Harding handled the situation with remarkable grace, accepting James's rejection with dignity while maintaining her social composure despite obvious disappointment. "Mr. Wallace," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the strain of public rejection, "I thank you for your honesty, even though it's not what I hoped to hear. You're quite right that marriage should be based on mutual affection rather than strategic advantage." As the evening dissolved into awkward farewells and hastily arranged departures, Victoria found herself standing near the windows, watching guests leave while contemplating her brother's courageous choice to prioritize authentic feeling over family obligation. Luke Harrison approached her with quiet discretion, his presence offering comfort without presumption. "Miss Wallace," he said softly, "your brother showed remarkable courage this evening. It takes strength to choose personal truth over social expectation." Victoria turned to face him, seeing understanding and something deeper in his blue-gray eyes. "Mr. Harrison, I fear his courage will cost him dearly. Father won't easily forgive such public defiance of his plans." "Perhaps," Luke replied, moving slightly closer with careful attention to social proprieties, "but some things are worth the cost. Living authentically, choosing love over convenience, honoring personal truth even when it conflicts with external pressure." Victoria felt her breath catch at the implications in his words, the suggestion that he understood her own struggle between duty and desire. "That's a beautiful ideal, Mr. Harrison, but ideals don't always survive practical realities." Luke's expression grew intense as he seemed to recognize the personal significance of their conversation. "Miss Wallace, perhaps this is presumptuous, but it seems to me that you face similar choices about your own future. And it seems to me that someone with your intelligence and strength deserves the same kind of authentic happiness your brother chose to seek." Before Victoria could respond, Colonel Wallace's commanding voice cut across the room. "Victoria, please escort our remaining guests to the door. We have family matters to discuss that require privacy." As Luke Harrison prepared to leave with the Marshall family, he paused near Victoria with an expression that seemed to hold unspoken promises and dangerous possibilities. "Miss Wallace, I hope you'll remember that some opportunities require courage to seize, even when they seem impossible." Victoria felt her heart race at his words, which seemed to offer everything she'd been longing for while acknowledging the obstacles that stood between them. "Mr. Harrison, I'll remember everything about this evening." As the last guests departed and the ranch house settled into uncomfortable quiet, Victoria prepared for the family confrontation that would determine the course of her future. Colonel Wallace's expression promised serious consequences for James's public defiance, while her own heart churned with new possibilities awakened by Luke Harrison's implied invitation to choose courage over convention. The following morning brought a private family meeting that would reshape the Wallace household's future. Colonel Wallace's fury at James's public rejection of Miss Harding had cooled into the kind of strategic calculation that made him formidable in both business and family management. "James," he said with icy control, "your behavior last evening was unacceptable on every level. You've embarrassed our family, insulted our guests, and destroyed carefully arranged business advantages that would have benefited everyone involved." James faced his father's wrath with steady determination, his decision to prioritize authentic feeling over strategic advantage having strengthened rather than weakened his resolve. "Father, I understand your disappointment, but I cannot base my life on a lie. Miss Harding deserves better than dutiful marriage, and so do I." "What you deserve," Colonel Wallace replied sharply, "is determined by your obligations to this family and the legacy we've built together. Personal preferences are luxuries we cannot afford when the ranch's future depends on strategic alliances and business connections." Victoria listened to the confrontation with growing anxiety, recognizing that her brother's rebellion would likely result in increased pressure for her own compliance with matrimonial arrangements. Her father's plans for her marriage to Charles Harding would now carry additional weight as compensation for James's defiance. "Victoria," Colonel Wallace continued, turning his attention to his daughter with a kind of focus that brooked no contradiction, "James's selfish decision makes your upcoming marriage even more critical for our family's future. Charles Harding's business connections must now compensate for the railroad advantages we've lost through your brother's romantic foolishness." Victoria felt the moment of decision approaching with terrifying clarity. She could accept her father's arrangements and secure her family's financial future through marriage to a stranger, or she could follow her brother's example and choose authentic feeling over strategic advantage. "Father," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart, "perhaps James's decision offers us an opportunity to reconsider whether strategic marriages truly serve our family's best interests." Colonel Wallace's expression grew dangerous as he recognized potential rebellion from his previously compliant daughter. "Victoria, I trust you're not considering following your brother's foolish example. Our family cannot survive two children prioritizing romantic fantasy over practical responsibility." Victoria took a deep breath and made the choice that would transform her life. "Father, I cannot marry Charles Harding. I cannot bind myself to a stranger for the sake of business advantages when my heart belongs elsewhere." The silence that followed her declaration seemed to stretch forever, broken finally by her father's voice, cold with barely controlled fury. "Your heart belongs elsewhere? Victoria, what inappropriate attachment have you formed during Miss Harding's visit?" Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes as she prepared to confess feelings that would challenge every aspect of her comfortable existence. "I've come to care deeply for Luke Harrison, father. He's intelligent, honest, hard-working, and he makes me feel more alive than I've ever felt in my life." Colonel Wallace's face showed shock mixed with outrage as he processed this revelation. Luke Harrison? A ranch manager with no property, no family connections, no social position worthy of consideration? "Victoria, you cannot seriously contemplate throwing away your future for a man so far beneath your station." "He may not have inherited wealth or social position," Victoria replied with growing strength, "but he has character, integrity, and the kind of personal worth that seems more valuable than business connections or strategic advantages." James stepped forward to support his sister's courageous choice. "Father, Victoria deserves the same right to authentic happiness that I claimed for myself. Luke Harrison may not offer financial advantages, but he offers genuine affection and respect for Victoria as a person rather than a strategic asset." Colonel Wallace looked between his two children with the kind of military assessment that calculated strategic options and probable outcomes. "You're both willing to sacrifice our family's future for romantic ideals that may not survive the practical realities of daily life?" "We're willing to build our own futures based on authentic relationships rather than calculated arrangements," Victoria replied, feeling strength flow through her as she finally spoke her truth aloud. "And we believe that authentic happiness will ultimately serve our family better than strategic marriages that satisfy everyone except the people actually living them." The confrontation continued for several hours, with Colonel Wallace alternately threatening and pleading as he tried to convince his children to prioritize family obligations over personal desires. But James and Victoria remained united in their determination to choose authentic feeling over strategic advantage, despite the costs such choices would entail. Finally, recognizing that continued pressure would only strengthen his children's resolve, Colonel Wallace made a strategic decision that surprised everyone. "Very well," he said with the kind of calculated capitulation that characterized his most effective leadership. "If you're both determined to follow your hearts rather than your heads, I won't prevent you. but you'll both assume full responsibility for the consequences of your choices." Victoria felt a surge of gratitude mixed with apprehension as she recognized her father's grudging acceptance of their romantic rebellion. "Father, we understand the risks, and we accept responsibility for our decisions." "Then you'd better make certain your decisions serve you well," Colonel Wallace replied with the kind of paternal wisdom that acknowledged defeat while maintaining dignity. "Because you'll be living with the results for the remainder of your lives." 3 months later, on a crisp December morning with snow falling gently on the Wyoming mountains, Victoria Elizabeth Wallace became Mrs. Luke Harrison in a simple ceremony that prioritized genuine feeling over social spectacle. The wedding took place in the ranch house parlor, with family and close friends gathered to witness the union of two people whose love had overcome social conventions and strategic considerations. James served as best man for the marriage he'd helped make possible through his own courageous choice to prioritize authentic feeling over family obligation. Colonel Wallace walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle with paternal pride that had gradually replaced his initial fury as he observed the genuine happiness that Luke Harrison brought to Victoria's life. Luke had proven himself worthy of the Wallace family's respect through his dedicated work, his obvious devotion to Victoria, and his respectful navigation of the social complexities surrounding their unconventional courtship. Ben Marshall had generously arranged for Luke to purchase a small ranch adjacent to the Wallace property, ensuring that Victoria could remain near her family while building her own life with the man who had won her heart. As they exchanged vows in the warm glow of firelight and family love, Victoria reflected on the courage required to choose authentic feeling over social expectation. Her father's predicted business disasters had failed to materialize, while the genuine happiness she'd found with Luke seemed to radiate outward to benefit everyone around them. "I promise to love, honor, and cherish you," Luke said, his blue-gray eyes holding hers with the same intensity that had first captured her attention, "for all the days of our life together." "I promise to love, honor, and cherish you," Victoria replied, her voice strong with conviction and joy, "and to never regret choosing courage over convenience." As they sealed their union with a kiss that spoke of passion tempered by respect and desire strengthened by genuine understanding, Victoria felt the deep satisfaction that came from living authentically rather than merely surviving comfortably. The mountains rose around their valley home like protective walls, sheltering a love that had been worth every risk and every sacrifice required to claim it. Outside their windows, snow continued to fall on the beautiful, challenging country that had shaped their characters and brought them together. Inside their hearts, love burned warm and bright, promising a future built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and the kind of authentic partnership that transformed marriage from social obligation into personal joy.